when my daughter handed me the nursing home papers and said, "It's time to sell your assets, Mum," I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I picked up the pen, and I signed every single page. She smiled at me like she'd just won the lottery. She had no idea what she was actually signing. She had no idea that the woman sitting across that kitchen table, the one she thought was slipping, confused, and ready to be put away, had already moved every dollar of real money out of reach 3 years earlier. She had no idea that what she was about to inherit wasn't a fortune. It was a debt. A debt worth over $1 million, and as of that signature, it was hers. But let me back up, because you need to understand how a 71-year-old widow ends up sitting at her own kitchen table, calmly signing away her life to the daughter who raised her voice at her just to get what she wanted. My name is Eleanor. I was born in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knew whose porch light was on too late and whose garden needed weeding. My father worked at the mill. My mother cleaned houses on the side to make ends meet. I grew up watching every dollar get stretched until it screamed, and I promised myself that when I grew up, I would never let money control me the way it controlled my parents. I married young to a man named Walter. He wasn't rich. He wasn't flashy. He worked as an electrician for 34 years, and I taught 3rd grade for 29. We weren't the kind of people anybody would look at twice. We drove the same car for 12 years at a time. We clipped coupons. We took one vacation every summer, always somewhere within driving distance, and we put everything else into savings, into small investments, into a little rental property we bought in our 30s that we fixed up ourselves on weekends. Nobody knew what we were building. That was on purpose. Walter used to say something to me that I never forgot. He said, "Eleanor, the people who talk about their money the loudest are usually the ones with the least of it, and the people who never say a word are usually the ones you should worry about underestimating." By the time Walter passed, 6 years ago, from a heart attack that took him in his sleep, without so much as a warning, we had built something quiet, but real. 2 rental properties, fully paid off. A retirement account that had been growing since 1985, some careful investments in index funds that Walter managed himself, teaching himself from library books because he didn't trust financial advisors with slick suits and expensive watches. I won't tell you the exact number, because it doesn't matter. What matters is that it was enough. Enough that I never had to worry about a light bill again. Enough that I could have hired help around the house, taken trips, spoiled my grandchildren rotten. But I didn't do any of that, because Walter and I had also raised 2 children, and somewhere along the way, I started noticing something in both of them that worried me more than any heart condition ever could. My son, Bradley, was the older one. Sweet as a boy. Charming as a teenager, but somewhere in his 20s, charm turned into something else. He always had a plan, a business idea, an investment opportunity. A friend who knew a guy who could triple whatever money you gave him in 6 months. He went through 3 failed businesses before he was 40, and every single time he came to us for help. And every single time, Walter and I discussed it privately and decided how much we were willing to lose before we said yes. My daughter, Melissa, was different, but not better. She was organized. Controlled, she married a man named Dennis who worked in finance, or claimed to, and together they built a life that looked perfect from the outside. A big house in a gated community. Private school for their kids. 2 nice cars in the driveway. But Walter used to watch them at family dinners and shake his head afterward, once we were alone in the car. "They're living a life they can't afford," he told me once. "You can see it in the way she talks about money, like it's oxygen, like there's never enough of it in the room." He was right. He was always right about people, which is part of why I trusted his instincts even after he was gone. About 3 years before Walter died, we sat down with a lawyer, a quiet, careful man named Mr. Halloway, who had been recommended to us by a friend from church. We told him what we wanted. We wanted our assets protected, not from taxes, not from the government, but from our own children, from the very real possibility that one day, one or both of them would come looking for a payout before we were ready to give one, or before we were even gone. Mr. Halloway set up an irrevocable trust. The properties went into it. The investment accounts went into it. Everything that mattered went into a structure that neither Bradley nor Melissa could touch, borrow against, or pressure me into liquidating, no matter what kind of paperwork they put in front of me. The trust named a charity, a children's literacy foundation that Walter and I had supported quietly for over a decade, as the ultimate beneficiary, with a clause that allowed distributions to our grandchildren directly, for education only, administered by the trustee, not by their parents. We never told the kids, not because we didn't trust them with information, but because we didn't trust what they'd do with the information. Walter used to say that people show you who they really are the moment they think money is on the table, and he wanted to see who our children really were before he died, not after. He got his answer sooner than he expected. About 8 months before Walter passed, Bradley came to us needing money again. This time it wasn't a small ask. He wanted to open a franchise, some kind of specialty gym, and he needed $120,000 to make it happen. He didn't ask for a gift. He asked us to co-sign a business loan because his credit had been damaged by the last 2 failures, and no bank would touch him alone. Walter and I talked about it for 2 weeks. In the end, against my better judgment, Walter agreed to co-sign, but only under one condition. He had Mr. Halloway draft a private agreement, separate from the bank paperwork, stating that if the loan ever went into default, the debt would legally transfer to Bradley's share of any future inheritance before a single penny of the estate went to him. It was Walter's way of saying, "I'll help you, but I won't let you drag me down with you, and I won't let this become the family's problem if it fails." Bradley signed it without reading it closely. He was so excited about the gym that he barely looked at the fine print. That detail matters. Remember it. The gym failed within 14 months. Bradley walked away from it, declared a version of personal bankruptcy that protected most of his other assets, and the full weight of that $120,000 loan, plus accrued interest, defaulted straight onto the co-signed agreement. Because of the private clause Walter had built in, that debt didn't just sit with the bank, chasing Bradley. It became a lien against whatever inheritance Bradley was owed, and because of how Mr. Halloway structured it, that lien could be legally assigned to whoever took control of the estate on Bradley's behalf, if Bradley himself was ever declared unable to manage his own affairs. I know that sounds complicated. It gets simpler, I promise. Just hold on to that thread. Walter died 2 months after all of this happened. And I think, in some ways, watching what became of that gym and that loan broke something in him that a doctor could never diagnose. He never said it. But I know he died worried about what would happen to me once he was gone, surrounded by 2 children who had shown him, clearly, what mattered most to them. After Walter passed, I lived alone in the house we'd shared for 38 years. I was lonely, of course. Grief doesn't leave just because you keep busy. But I wasn't helpless. I still drove myself to church, to the grocery store, to my book club on Tuesdays. I still balanced my own checkbook and paid my own bills. I was sharp. I was, and still am, entirely in my right mind. But somewhere around the 2nd year after Walter's death, Melissa started visiting more often. At first, I was grateful. I thought maybe grief had softened something in her, made her want to be closer to her mother. I should have known better. Melissa never did anything without a reason. She started asking small questions during her visits. How much was the house worth now? Had I thought about downsizing? Wasn't it a lot of space for one person? Did I ever forget where I put things? She'd laugh when she asked that last one, like it was a joke, but I could see her watching my face closely for the answer. I started writing things down after those visits. Not because I was losing my memory, but because I wanted a record. I wanted proof, if I ever needed it, that I was being watched, tested, evaluated by my own daughter like a piece of property up for appraisal. About 4 months ago, Melissa showed up with Dennis, which she almost never did, and with her brother Bradley, which she really never did. Since the two of them fought more than they got along, the three of them sat me down in my own living room like it was an intervention, and Melissa did most of the talking. She said she'd noticed some concerning signs. She said I'd missed a doctor's appointment, which was true, because I'd simply written the wrong date on my calendar, a mistake anyone could make. She said the house was getting to be too much for me to manage alone. She said, and this is the part that still makes my jaw tighten, that she and Dennis had already looked into a lovely assisted living community, and that it would be so much easier on everyone if I just went ahead and started the process of simplifying my affairs. Bradley barely spoke. He just sat there, nodding along, and I understood immediately why he was there. He needed money. His life after the gym failure had not improved, and whatever Melissa was offering him as a cut of what they expected to gain from me, it was enough to get him to sit in my living room and pretend he was concerned about my well-being instead of his own empty pockets. I want to be honest with you. In that moment, sitting in my own living room, being told by my children that I needed to be managed, something in me went very cold and very still. Not sad, not confused, calm, in the specific way Walter used to get right before he made a decision that would matter. I asked Melissa a simple question. I asked her what simplifying my affairs actually meant. She slid a folder across the coffee table. Inside were papers for a durable power of attorney, giving her full financial control over my accounts, my property, and my ability to make legal decisions. There was also a preliminary application for a nursing facility, one of those expensive private ones, along with a real estate agent's card clipped to a printed estimate of what my house could sell for. She had already talked to a real estate agent about my house before she'd even asked me a single real question about how I was feeling, how I was doing, whether I even wanted to move. She had priced my life and put it in a folder. I looked at that folder for a long time. Long enough that Melissa started to look nervous, like maybe she'd overplayed her hand. Dennis shifted in his seat. Bradley wouldn't meet my eyes, and then I did something that surprised all three of them. I said, "All right." Melissa blinked. "All right. What?" "All right, I'll sign," I said. "If this is what you all think is best for me, I trust you." I watched relief and greed move across her face at the same time, which is a strange thing to witness on someone you gave birth to. She practically pushed the pen into my hand. Here's what none of them knew. Here's what I hadn't told a single soul, except for Mr. Halloway, who had passed away himself the year before, but whose practice had been taken over by his son, a sharp young lawyer named Peter, who I had already been quietly working with for over a year. Everything of real value, every dollar that mattered, had been inside that irrevocable trust for 6 years at that point. The house I lived in, the one Melissa had already gotten appraised, was not technically mine anymore either. 2 years earlier, on Peter's advice, I had transferred the deed into the trust as well, while retaining what's called a life estate. meaning I had the legal right to live in it until I died or chose to leave, but I no longer owned it outright. It could not be sold out from under me, and more importantly, it could not be used as collateral or liquidated by anyone holding power of attorney over my remaining personal accounts. What was left in my personal name, the part Melissa was about to gain control over, was almost nothing in terms of assets. A small checking account I used for groceries and utilities. And one other thing. Bradley's defaulted loan. Remember that clause Walter had built in, all those years ago? The one that said if Bradley's co-signed loan ever defaulted, the debt would transfer as a lien against whoever managed Bradley's share of the estate, if Bradley was ever declared unable to manage his own affairs. About a year after the gym failed, during one of his lowest points, Bradley had actually filed paperwork declaring a temporary inability to manage his financial affairs in order to qualify for a certain kind of debt relief program. It helped him in the short term. But it also legally triggered Walter's old clause. The lien didn't just sit quietly with Bradley anymore. It became attached to whoever was named as financial decision-maker in any document Bradley signed involving shared family assets going forward, including any document where Bradley Co. signed as a willing party to a family financial decision, which is exactly what he did that day in my living room, when he added his signature underneath Melissa's on the power of attorney paperwork, agreeing to act as a secondary approver. Neither of them read the fine print. Neither of them had any idea that by putting their names on those documents, together, in that combination, they were legally accepting responsibility for a debt that, with years of accumulated interest and legal fees from the default, had grown to just over $1 million. I signed my name at the bottom of every page that day, calmly, without a single tear, because I already knew what was in those papers wasn't a windfall for my children. It was a trap they had built for themselves, out of their own greed, years before they ever set foot in my living room with that folder. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from Melissa. Her voice was different. Higher, tighter. "Mum," she said. "There's something wrong with these documents. Our lawyer is saying we're liable for some kind of loan. $1 million, Mum. What is this?" I sat down in my kitchen chair, the same one I'd been sitting in when I signed those papers, and I let the silence stretch out for a moment before I answered her. "That's your father's doing," I said, "not mine. He built a promise into that old loan agreement your brother signed years ago about what would happen if it ever defaulted and someone else took control of his financial decisions. You and Bradley did that yourselves when you put both your names on the documents you brought to my house. You knew about this," she said. It wasn't a question. You knew. And you let us sign. "I let you do what you were already trying to do to me," I said. "You didn't ask me if I wanted to move into a facility. You told me you already had a real estate agent lined up before you asked how I was feeling. You brought your brother, who hasn't spoken to me in 8 months except to ask for money, to sit in my living room and pretend he cared about my well-being. I signed what you put in front of me, the same way you expected me to sign what you put in front of me. I just happened to know what was actually in it." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow, the sound of someone doing math in their head and not liking the answer. "What about the house?" she finally asked. "The assisted living place, the money from selling the house. There is no money from the house," I said. "I don't own the house anymore, Melissa. I haven't for 2 years. It belongs to a trust that your father and I set up long before he died, and neither of you were ever entitled to $1 of it while I'm alive, or frankly much of anything after I'm gone, either, given what I've watched the two of you do to get here." I could hear her start to cry, but I want to be honest with you, it wasn't the kind of crying that moves you. It was the kind of crying that comes from someone realizing a plan has fallen apart, not the kind that comes from genuine remorse. I've heard both kinds of crying in my life. I know the difference. Before I tell you what happened in the weeks after that phone call, I need to tell you about the night before Melissa and Dennis and Bradley showed up with that folder, because I think it explains something important about how I was able to stay so calm when it finally happened. I'd had a dream about Walter that night. Not an unusual thing. I dreamed about him often in those first few years after he passed. But this dream was different. In it, we were sitting at the same kitchen table, the one that still sits in my kitchen today, and he was going through a stack of papers, the way he used to on Sunday evenings, checking figures with a pencil behind his ear. He looked up at me and said, "They're going to test you, Eleanor, sooner than you think. Don't let them see you flinch." I woke up before dawn, and I lay there in the quiet house for a long time, turning that dream over in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just grief finding a new shape to take. But 2 days later, Melissa called to say she and Dennis wanted to come by for a visit, and something in her voice, a little too bright, a little too rehearsed, made the hair rise on the back of my neck. I called Peter that same afternoon. I told him I had a feeling something was coming, and I wanted to go over everything one more time, every document, every clause, every contingency, just to be sure I understood exactly what I was protected against and what I wasn't. We sat in his office for almost 2 hours. He walked me through the trust structure again, slowly, patiently, the way his father used to. He reminded me about the lien clause tied to Bradley's old loan, something I hadn't thought about in years, and he made sure I understood, in plain language, what would happen if that clause were ever triggered by someone else taking control of my financial decisions. I left his office that day feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, prepared, not for a specific event, not yet, but prepared in the way you feel after checking that every door in your house is locked before a storm. I didn't know the storm would arrive 2 days later, wearing my daughter's face, and carrying a folder with a real estate agent's card clipped to the front of it. But when it did, I wasn't caught off guard. I was simply watching a thing unfold that some part of me had already braced for. I think about that dream often now. I don't know if it was truly Walter reaching out from somewhere, or just my own mind, shaped by 38 years of marriage to a careful, watchful man, doing what he had trained me to do, without either of us ever calling it training. Either way, I'm grateful for it. It gave me one more day of preparation I didn't know I needed, and when the moment came, I didn't flinch. The weeks that followed were not easy, even though I had planned for this moment for years. Bradley called me twice, once angry, accusing me of setting a trap for my own children, and once, a few days later, quiet and almost pleading, asking if there was any way to undo what had happened, any way I could help them cover the debt. I told him the same thing both times. I told him that I hadn't set a trap. His father had, years earlier, when Bradley asked for help he wasn't ready to be responsible for. I told him that the debt had existed long before that folder ever landed on my coffee table, and that the only thing that changed that day was who was now legally required to answer for it, because of choices he and his sister made on their own, without ever once asking me what I actually wanted for my own future. Melissa didn't call again after that first conversation. She sent one email a few weeks later, short and formal, informing me that she and Dennis were consulting with a lawyer about their options regarding the debt. I never heard whether anything came of it. Peter, my lawyer, told me later that the agreement Walter had built, all those years ago, was airtight. There wasn't much room to challenge it. Not without dragging Bradley's own signed bankruptcy paperwork into court and proving things about his financial history that neither he nor Melissa wanted made public. As for the nursing home, I never moved. I'm still in the house I raised my children in, the one with the kitchen table where all of this unfolded. I have a part-time helper now, a lovely woman named Consuela, who comes 3 days a week to help with cleaning and errands, paid for out of the trust, arranged entirely by Peter, without a single request or approval needed from either of my children. I chose that help myself, on my own terms, because I decided I needed it, not because someone else decided for me, and then priced my house before asking. I want to tell you something about grief, and about grief's strange cousin, clarity. Losing Walter broke my heart in a way I don't think will ever fully heal. But it also gave me something I didn't expect. It gave me time, alone, to see my children clearly, without the fog of daily family life clouding the picture. I saw who came around when they needed something, and who came around simply to sit with me. I saw who asked how I was doing, and actually waited for the answer, and who asked how I was doing as a way of getting to the next question, the one about money, the one about the house, the one about how much longer I might need any of it. There was one more conversation I haven't told you about yet, one that happened almost 2 months after everything settled. One that I think matters more than the phone calls, more than the folder, more than any of it. My granddaughter, Bradley's youngest, a bright, quiet girl named Sophie, who was 17 at the time, called me on a Tuesday evening, out of nowhere. She'd heard pieces of what happened, second-hand, through arguments her parents thought she wasn't listening to. She asked me, carefully, almost afraid of the answer, whether I still loved her father, whether all of this meant our family was broken for good. I told her the truth. I told her that loving someone and protecting yourself from someone are not opposites, that you can hold both at the same time without one cancelling out the other. I told her that I loved her father very much, the boy he used to be and the man I still hoped he could become, but that loving him didn't mean I had to hand him the keys to my entire life simply because he asked, especially not when he'd shown me, more than once, that he wasn't ready to be trusted with them. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me something that caught me off guard. She asked if I was scared, being alone, without her dad or her Aunt Melissa checking in on me the way they used to before all of this. I told her no. I told her that being surrounded by people who only show up when they want something isn't the same as not being alone. It just feels busier. I told her that real company, the kind that actually fills up an empty house, comes from people who show up simply because they want to be near you, not because they're calculating what being near you might eventually be worth. That conversation with Sophie did more to heal something in me than any of the legal victories, any of the trust documents, any of the careful planning Walter and I had done over the years. It reminded me why all of it mattered in the first place. Not to win, not to punish, but to protect something worth protecting, so that when the people who actually deserved my love and my time came looking for me, there would still be something real left to give them. I don't say any of this with bitterness anymore. I said it with plenty of bitterness the first few weeks after that phone call with Melissa. I won't pretend otherwise. But bitterness is heavy, and I'm 71 years old, and I've decided I don't have the energy left to carry things that heavy for very long. What I carry now is something closer to peace. I know exactly where my money is going. Most of it, when I'm gone, will go to that children's literacy foundation Walter and I supported quietly for years, the one that never once asked us for anything beyond what we chose to give. A portion is set aside, through the trust, for my grandchildren's education, administered directly by Peter's firm, so that it can never be touched, borrowed against, or managed by anyone standing between them and their own futures. My grandchildren, by the way, still call me every Sunday. That relationship, thankfully, was never part of any folder, any appraisal, any signature. It exists entirely outside of what happened between me and their parents, and I intend to protect it fiercely, exactly the way I protected everything else. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I think there is, it's not really about money, even though money is the thread that runs through the whole story. It's about paying attention. It's about noticing, early, who shows up for you simply to be near you, and who shows up already calculating what being near you might eventually be worth. It's about understanding that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just an open door for people to walk through and take whatever they decide they're owed. Walter used to tell me that the people who talk about money the loudest usually have the least of it, and the ones who stay quiet are the ones you should never underestimate. I think about that almost every day now. I think about how quiet we were, all those years, building something slowly, carefully, while our children grew into adults who assumed quiet meant empty, who assumed a modest house and an old car meant there was nothing left to protect. They were wrong. And more importantly, they learned, the hard way, that the assumptions you build your greed on can collapse under you just as easily as any business, any gym, any franchise, any shortcut to a life you haven't actually earned yet. I signed that folder without a single tear, because by the time it landed on my coffee table, I had already spent years making sure that whatever they thought they were taking from me, they were actually only taking what they had built for themselves, one careless signature at a time. I still live in my house. I still drive myself to church on Sundays. I still balance my own checkbook every single week, down to the penny, exactly the way I always have. And every single time I sit down at that kitchen table, the same one where I once calmly signed away $1 million that was never really mine to lose, I feel something I didn't expect to feel at this stage of my life. I feel completely, entirely